Welcome, everyone. I'm happy to welcome you in the name of Civil 7 to today's event, From Commitment to Action, Feminist Foreign Policy of the G7. Let's have a brief look at our program today. We have a first panel on the potential of feminist foreign policy for the advancement of global justice and sustainable development. And the second one, where we will learn more on the state of implementation by the G7 countries. And for the last 20 to 25 minutes, we want to go in an open discussion with all of you. So starting with our first panel, I'm happy to welcome Kirti Jayakumar. She is a feminist researcher working in the area of women, peace and security, transitional justice, and feminist foreign policy. She's also the founder of the Gender Security Project, one of the few women, peace and security centers that is based in the Global South. And she's co-chair of the Women 7 Working Group on Feminist Foreign Policy. Welcome, Kirti. I'm also happy to welcome Mabel Bianco, who chairs together with Kirti the Women 7 Working Group on Feminist Foreign Policy. She is a physician, and I looked at your CV, and you have a really impressive experience on advocating for women's rights, especially on health services and sex education within different international processes, G7, G20, and beyond. And Mabel is also the president and founder of the Foundation for Studies and Research on Women. And I'm happy to welcome Miriam Mona Mukalazi. She's a PhD researcher on feminist security policy and member of the supervisory board of Forum ZFD, which is an organization working in civic conflict resolution and peace building. Happy to have you all here. To dive right into it, my first question is feminist foreign policy a real game changer? Does it really has the potential to, for in-depth change, or is it more or less a repacking of gender equality methods that we already know? And I would like to give the word first to you, Mabel.
Thank you so much, Sophie. And I want to say hello to everybody. I find some friends in the audience, so I'm very happy that we can meet for some of them that we have been working hard. I want to say that as we have been, some years ago in 2019, I think, or 18, we started to simultaneously to develop feminist foreign policy as a way to strengthen and reinforce our countries in the different countries. It doesn't matter if they are low income, middle income, high income, because sometimes it seems to be feminist foreign policy are only for the developed countries. And this is not true, because it's very important. All countries have a perspective in their foreign policies that are coherent with their internal policies to ensure gender equality, but in a way that is not only in words, is in actions. That's the difference. And why we put this in such a case, in such a way? Because we consider, some of us, that they were some governments, but they were most of feminist groups, that the foreign policies are not really being what we want as feminists to see. And by the other hand, simultaneously, we try to organize the Gender Equality Forum, having this proposal to have these two forums in Mexico and France in order to change how it was addressed the issues of gender equality or gender issues in the UN, where we have so many countries with different problems and we are not able to advance. So the issue is that finally we couldn't obtain in the Gender Equality Forum what we proposed because they were coming again with the same issues or problems, that we have in the UN discussions. But the difference with the feminist foreign policy is that they are, first of all, we have a definition that I think is very important because it's really a policy of a state. I'm going to read how we define in Women 7, is interaction in a manner that prioritizes peace, gender equality, and environmental integrity, enshrining, promotes, and protects the human rights of all, seeks to disrupt colonial, racist, patriarchal, and male-dominated power structures, and allocate significant resources, including research, to achieve that vision. I think with this, we give a panorama how these are defined, and these need to be defined at national level, but not only by governments and not only by the Foreign Affairs Office. It needs to be done by the government plus the feminist groups. And this is how we started working in what we call a global network of feminist policies, where we have representatives from governments and representatives from our groups of feminists. And this is something that makes a difference. And the other difference is that we need to ensure to have the money allocation. And this is not only from the foreign affairs, this is also for all the government, but specifically for the development areas of the government. Why? Because we need to put programs in place through the government. And this is not the foreign policy makes the announcement and the big panorama, but the other is coming through external cooperation among countries, poor and rich, doesn't matter, in which they ensure to have the programs and to have the money allocated to develop the programs, because it's not only the way to put the titles or the description. It's necessary to ensure that we have the money. And also the great important issue that we need to change the colonial, racist, patriarchal, and male-dominated power that in general are in the foreign affairs in all countries. And this is something that is very important because we could be colonial being in the global south. That's one of the issues we need to understand. These are concepts that we are not, we need to really make clear that the policies are not having any of these. So I know it's very difficult, but this is how the feminists, we find and we want to have the policies. And this is something very important if it's going to be a policy. And the last point I want to say is that we request to have a year by year accountable measure in which we are going to find out the coherence. And of course, as G7 is representing the most, the most rich countries or developed, or how you want to call them, we propose to have altogether these discussions with the women from the South. We mentioned Global South. Meanwhile, it's necessary to clarify that sometimes Global South has this perspective of colonialism and racism that we want to say against. But one of the important points in our work in Women 7 this year is that we were women from the North and from the South. So from the South, we have the obligation to let know the women from the North that they need to take care how their governments are approaching the external cooperation. And as many of the G7 have no feminist foreign policies, we request and we claim all of them have it. And the best result is what happened in Germany, where they assume, we present this to the chancellor, and they assume making, since the beginning, the two groups working together and related. The development ministry, where all programs for internal and external cooperation are promoting, that must be centered on gender equality, and the foreign affairs, where we are defining these policies, but we need to have in these foreign affairs more women representation at the top level. And we need to have also, to be coherent, gender equality. And gender equality is parity, is equal power, and is also the possibility to influence the money allocation. So we say without the proportion of the money and the clear advice that now in such a days we are having a problem of the funding of those that they are promoting at government, but at non-governmental, gender equality and human rights and women's rights, because the money that the others, the anti-choice, the anti-women's rights, and that they remain racist, colonial, and so on, they are having a lot of resources. So our countries, poor or rich, doesn't matter, need to consider how to support those women's feminist groups and how to ensure that they are going to be able to work for long term, because those issues are not reached in 1 year. We need long term. I hope I give you some ideas. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very rich overview. I'd like to hand over to Kirti to comment on that or to add.
Thank you, Sophie, and thank you, Mabel. It's always a tough act to follow when you share ever so thoughtfully. So thank you for setting the stage on that. For me, I believe that the way in which feminist foreign policy is being practiced in the here and now leaves a lot to be desired. We need a foreign policy that is gender equality plus. It doesn't help to have a gender equality centric policy or a policy that adds gender equality and stirs the mix up and then endorses the term feminist to make it look good. What we see happening is countries adopting feminist foreign policies in name, but they're also supporting wars with arms exports. They're also normalizing the murder of indigenous women on their territories. They're also shaming women of color. They're also targeting communities of color. And they're normalizing militarized intervention in the name of protecting women. So, for example, weaponizing the women, peace and security agenda to protect women of color from men of color. And that's an unhealthy approach if we want to really shift power, if we really want to look at feminizing our foreign policies, as it were. I believe that for the longest time, the Global South has been a passive recipient of foreign policy, whether it's in the form of aid or even decision-making or even the consensus around conventions that are passed and adopted, resolutions as well. However, I would like to say that feminist foreign policy has long been practiced by women in the global south. Women have resisted colonialism, women have questioned systemic violence and have done significant amount of work, perhaps not necessarily documenting it as scholarship in contemporary times does, but they have continued to show up to dismantle structural and patriarchal violence that has continued to be normalized in their countries. So in that sense, I would 100% agree that feminist foreign policy, if it is practiced and informed by the wisdom of women in the global south, can be a true game changer, but it has to be gender equality plus. To borrow the words of Dr. Tony Hastrup, at all points, a basic formula for feminist foreign policy should be some amount of addressing gender equality. But what beyond that? Can we look at ways to shift power? Can we look at ways to dismantle the military-industry complex? Can we look at ways to redistribute socio-political economic capital? I'll stop for now. I'd love to see what Miriam has to share and then take this forward with that.
Thank you very much. You already mentioned that intersectionality plays a significant role in the shifting of power. And with that question, I would like to go to you, Miriam, about the potential of feminist foreign policy for an intersectional approach and how intersectionality really would look in the practice.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. So regarding intersectionality, in the main definitions we see across countries, but also society, they claim that intersectionality is at the center of their feminist foreign policy. And I think this is already an achievement, because when we talk about intersectionality, it has a long legacy of Black feminism, post-colonial feminism, which are more the radical ones. So we can see that definitely as an achievement. But what we can also see, a lot of other feminist concepts, we can see with intersectionality that it's being watered down or not fully understood. Because often we can see when member states talk about intersectionality, they only use a few layers of oppression. Although when we talk about intersectionality, the key point is to really embrace and understand the intersection of all forms of oppression. For example, when we see how the EU or also Germany talks about feminist foreign policy and intersectionality, we often see the intersection between race and gender, or gender and religion sometimes, but we hardly see the intersection with ableism. We hardly see also the intersection with class, which I think is a critical point also when we talk about empowerment in general. So I would say that it is an achievement that we have this radical concept now in foreign policy embedded, but still you can definitely see how it's already being watered down. And it's a shame, because also one key aspect of intersectionality is including diverse voices, and those diverse voices usually come from civil society. And I think that's also one of the key points of a feminist foreign policy, that civil society really participates in the policy making and decision making. And I think there's still a long way to go.
Thank you very much. Mabel, do you want to react to that?
Yes, I want to thank Miriam for this. And I want to add that intersectionality includes some more difficult now, because we need to enter these definitions in which, of course, they are not so clear. The big issues, as for example, Black women or Black people and others, but those more related in which they are also included, because we have also the addition or some of the different categories. And for example, if you consider Black people or Afro-descendant or indigenous and disabled and LGBTQI and migrants and so on. So these are the key issues in which we need to look. That is necessary that intersectionality was understood, including all these combinations. And of course, for these, we need that at country level, the participation of the feminist groups also include the diversity of all women and girls. What we mean? LGBTQI must be there. Also must be the disabled, or must be the migrants and displaced. So why? Because the perspective needs to be harmonized, and we need all the voices together. I know it's difficult, and I know in the North, and specifically in Europe, with the migration, is a great problem. We have also now in Latin America and the Caribbean through the migration from, for example, Venezuela and so on. So we need to look desperately how we mobilize our governments to have these foreign feminist policies, including this criteria of intersectionality. And we need to make them accountable. And we need to denounce if they are not. Sorry, but this is our role in this life, that NGOs and women's groups, we are denouncing if necessary, but also we help to build up. And I want to say also that, because I didn't mention and Kirti mentioned, the issue of we want to have a decrease in the funds of militaries. We want to demilitarize. But the war among Ukraine, Russia, and all this makes now a problem for that. But we need to insist. We need to avoid to have such expenses on militaries and armament, because these are also in developing countries, in low income and middle income, decreasing the amount of money we have for social programs and specific for feminist programs. So we need to decrease that, and we need to also have peace. The war is not the place where human rights can be guaranteed. Thank you.
Thank you. One last question to Kirti and Miriam. If you now imagine, effected, implemented feminist foreign policy, how would the relation between G7 countries and Global South, or Global North and Global South in general, change?
Thank you for your question there, Sophie. I've thought about this a lot of times, and I think the one starting point that I find myself going to at all times has been about how the G7 countries that have been colonial powers in the past have never shown accountability for what colonialism did to the world. There has never been a transitional justice from colonialism. There has been a wave of decolonization, but not from colonialism, which is why the philosophy, the way of thinking, continues to pervade everything. Neocolonialism, co-colonization, they continue like it's business as usual. So I believe that we need a global healing process that moves out of colonialism. And that should start from the G7 countries being deeply acknowledging and providing reparations for the harm caused by colonialism. Now, this is not to mean that the Global South is completely free of colonial structures with that gesture, because within the Global South, and I can say this for the truth in India, we have divided ourselves on the fractured lines that the British found as an opportunity to divide and rule us. And these structures have continued to normalize genocides across the world today. Our history is full of these narratives. So we've continued with a legacy of pain that has not had an iteration of justice. So that's one point. And the second piece is that the G7 countries would cede space. the idea of a Westphalian state has been imposed on the postmodern world, and that has normalized so many colonial structures in countries that are continuing to be passive recipients of foreign policy. So ceding space and centering countries that have historically been elbowed out of the international relations process, as it were, would be the second point. And the final piece, before I pass on the mic to Miriam, the final piece, I believe, is really stepping up to question whether it's the system talking or the actor in the system talking to keep the system alive. Every state is responsible for entrenching power because it is serving someone. So if a decision maker sitting in a policy-making room can take a minute to really think about whether they're representing the interests of the last mile in their country, and if not, to cede space again to that last mile, then we're looking at transformative change. I know this can sound like we're asking for a lot, but it's just behavioral at this point.
So yeah, I can definitely just add on what my previous speakers have said. And I like to point out maybe more practical things. I think in a perfect world with feminist foreign policy, we wouldn't have this discussion anymore about whose feminism is the right one, or what I mean with that we can often see that countries in the global north act as neutral, or they have a neutral feminism, or the legitimate feminism. But it's not true, because also, for example, in Europe, we have different influences of feminist traditions that have entered the policies and then have an effect of how those countries also pursue a feminist foreign policy in the global south. So I think in a perfect setting, we wouldn't have this discussion anymore. We would acknowledge that there are different ways also to approach a feminist foreign policy, and we would acknowledge that also the global south is a side of knowledge production about feminism. And that leads me to my second point. I think in the perfect setting, it would also be that the global south is not only seen as a side of implementation for those policies coming from the global north, but all global south countries would be recognized as also design thinkers, policymakers regarding feminist foreign policy. We have a really long way to go, because it's still, and that goes back to this colonial thinking that many countries in the global north have, is that their feminism is the only true one, and that the global south has to learn the true feminism from them. And I think there also lies the really transformative potential of feminist foreign policy, again, really to recognize that we have so many different influences of feminist traditions, and that they can come together.
Thank you very much. I'd like to move on to the next part on translating the commitment into action. G7 on their way to feminist foreign policy. I'm very happy to welcome Marie Soulier. She is the head of Gender, Education, Population and Youth Unit at the Ministry of Europe and Foreign Affairs of France. Welcome, Marie. I'm also happy to welcome Norsine Grigolait-Dagiab. She's the Deputy Head of the Gender Equality Unit at the Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development in Germany, and Xenia Kellner, the co-founder of Young Feminist Europe and representative at the Global Civil Society Advisory Group at the Generation Equality Forum, where we already heard about today from Marble at UN Women. I'd like to give the word directly to you, Marie, to give us a short overview on the state of implementation within the French development policies.
Thank you so much for inviting us. And on behalf of France, we are really happy to share quickly an overview of the feminist diplomacy that we adopted in 2019. We are very glad to see that this discussion on feminist diplomacy take place in different spaces, and not only within the feminist group like the Women's Event, but also more broadly within all the civil society organization like today. So congratulations for that. Indeed, we strongly believe that the first step of feminist diplomacy is also to adopt a gender mainstreaming approach and to ensure a full appropriation of gender equality subjects by all the actors. Following the example of few like-minded countries, as you know, France has adopted a feminist foreign diplomacy, making gender equality a key priority for France, both at domestic level and at the international level. Our feminist diplomacy is implementing through our international strategy for gender equality, which adopts for the first time a gender mainstreaming approach to all components of our foreign policy, not only development, but also economic diplomacy, including both external and internal perspective. Our strategy guides the cross-cutting integration of gender issues in French diplomacy, targeting ambitious, both dedicated and transversal objectives for all actors of our diplomatic network, including our agency like AFD, Agence Française de Développement, to make gender equality a top priority. Our ministry follows a twin-track approach of mainstreaming gender equality while improving its dedicated actions and policy. For instance, the international component is driven by a gender equality plan in the workplace, in addition to our international strategy. We are in the process of assessing our current strategy and elaborating the new one in 2023. This new strategy will be the opportunity for us to define more in depth what a feminist foreign policy according to France. So based on the lessons learned for this first and current phase, we really want to go deeper on what is the concept of feminist foreign policy for France. In this sense, our discussion today is really inspiring and feed our reflections on that subject. So many thanks again for your invitation. Just few more words to say that our feminist diplomacy it's also characterized by a human rights approach within all our action and with the launch and implementation of strong actions both at multilateral and bilateral level. Our idea is really to be in all fora to be sure that gender equality is in everywhere. It's in all our actions. Since 2019, France took several measures to translate its commitment into action, and I would like to mention few initiatives that we support. First, we can mention AFAWA initiative, which is a women entrepreneur in Africa initiative, which aim at facilitate their access to funding. This initiative is now implementing in 23 countries, mainly in Africa, with the African Development Bank, and supports more than 400 female entrepreneurs. We can also mention the Global Survival Fund, led by the two 2018 Peace Nobel Prize winner, the well-known Dr. Mukwege and Nadia Murad. France supported politically and financially the creation of this fund and continued to do so. Another key initiative for us is the Support Fund for Feminist Organization, launched by our President Emmanuel Macron in 2019, following the G7. This fund has mobilized 120 million over the 3 years, 2020, 2021, and 2022, to fund the activities of feminist movements around the world, especially in low-income countries. This fund has been renewed, and we are really glad of this announcement. And we will continue to work closely with all the civil society in the coming years on gender equality. Finally, and as you all know, France has co-organized with Mexico and UN Women the Generation Equality Forum last year in Paris. As you know as well, $40 billion have been announced at the forum to enhance gender equality in the next 5 years. It's historical commitment. It is an historical commitment, and we need to first deliver on this commitment and also to call other countries to join and take strong commitment on gender equality too. You can count on France to strengthen this strong message and to call other countries to join us in this huge partnership. Beside this program, you can count on France to continue to advocate for stronger gender mainstreaming approach within all multilateral policies and action. And I will talk about this in a moment. Many thanks.
Thank you, Marie. I'd like to hand over now to Nunzi to hear about the implementation in Germany.
Great, thank you very much, Sophie. Thank you for the invitation. Good to see some familiar faces and see some familiar names, and also, of course, new names and new faces. Yes, I would like to kind of focus on kind of two aspects. One would be the implementation of the G7 agenda, also as an update from Germany's perspective, and the other part would be, just sharing a bit on the process of Germany's road to a feminist development policy, and also our exchange with CSOs in both those contexts. So regarding the state of things on the G7 agenda and the deliverables, as you're aware that during Germany's G7 presidency this year, we've set out an ambitious gender equality agenda, and I would like to just focus on a couple of aspects. One would be the important aspect of financing for gender equality. As you're probably aware, the G7 have made a commitment to increase the share of ODA, advancing gender equality and women's empowerment over the coming years. And for Germany, on the German side, and also as a means to implement the feminist development policy, we have set out a target. Our minister has communicated that until 2025, overall 93% of the BMZ's funds will support projects that target gender equality as a principal or a significant objective. Out of this, 8% is dedicated for measures that target gender equality as a principal objective. We believe this is a major step in providing a financial backing in gender equality policies, which is so important. The other financial aspect is, of course, our cooperations through civil society organizations. I think we can learn a lot also from the civil society in this regard. The civil society organizations that Germany funds already strongly target the advancement of gender equality. Even already today, over 20% of the CSO activities that our ministry supports are already targeting gender equality as a principal objective. So when we talk about putting gender equality on the top of the agenda, what does that really mean and how do we measure it? And one, of course, is the financing part, which is the quantity part, but also, of course, the quality. So we don't want to stop there. We do want to, we do see a lot of room for improvement, especially regarding G1, the gender mainstreaming. We don't want this to be a ticking the box exercise, but really want to also improve, of course, the quality, the new approaches. See, are we really using gender transformative approaches? Are we taking an intersectional approach, etc.? So these two aspects, quality and quantity. Another important part of the gender equality agenda of the G7 was care work. I think many of you know that we had a high-level G7 event in April this year, and also in the context of our communique, of the development ministers' communique, there are some concrete kind of commitments regarding membership of the Global Alliance for Care, supporting the UN Women Practitioners Toolkit on unpaid and paid care work, but also a very kind of substantial financing commitment on childcare infrastructure via the World Bank, to which Germany contributed 20 million euros. Another aspect I would like to mention in the context of the G7 agenda is, of course, the education and how gender-based violence and the fight against gender-based violence has to be also an important part of education very early on. We have increased our contribution to the United Nations Girls' Education Initiative in order to build a global network for gender transformative education. And its goal is to eliminate gender stereotypes in childhood, and it involves civil society actors in decisions on education funding and policy. Some concrete actions include minimum standards for gender transformative education, also the compilation of good practices, which we believe is important. I do have some notes on women in conflict, crisis, displacement, and also SRHR, which were also important aspects of our gender equality agenda within the G7, but maybe I would just leave this out for now, because I don't want to take up too much time before we head into the discussion. But then maybe just briefly on the state of things regarding our new feminist development policy, which our minister has announced in February this year. So it's all still quite fresh and fast, but we have gone through a very extensive consultation process, which focused on really getting the expertise and the feedback from the civil society organizations. We started with 2 big discussion rounds in Germany with the civil society here and their expertise, and learning from them, the kind of the key elements they see in a feminist development policy. And then, of course, we went broader. We did a very broad online survey where over 400 people were invited to participate, and that had a focus on, getting the voices from the Global South, from the civil society of the Global South. And then we had further consultation rounds end of September, back to back with a high-level event our minister attended. We had focus group discussions which focused on various important topics such as climate justice and also climate justice, just transition, food security, health, peace, conflict, migration, women's economic empowerment, and also GBV. So we really started drafting. Really, the first sentence we drafted was after we did this extensive consultation process. There was no kind of pre-draft we went into the discussion, the consultation with, but it was really meant to, first inform us through the civil society and then start drafting ourselves. So now we're in that process that we're establishing a first draft and, discussing within our ministry, and then, of course, exchanging also with the Foreign Office on this. So we are optimistic to have the new strategy in spring next year, and which should be followed by an even more concrete gender action plan with indicators in the second half of next year. And maybe one last sentence is regarding the increased cooperation with civil society. This is, of course, a very important part of a feminist approach in general. So we will be looking into means how to better include civil society, especially local civil society, into the planning and implementation of our projects, and also how we can better and stronger finance feminist CSOs in the Global South directly. So I stop here for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to give the word now to Xenia, who is a consultant and civil society representative in various international outreach processes regarding feminist foreign policy. Xenia, from what we've heard now from Germany and France, when we put that in the international context and also in comparison to other G7 countries, but beyond, how do you assess the state of implementation?
Thank you, Sophie, and hello, everyone. It's really good to be with you. I think what's interesting to see is that the concept of feminist foreign policy, it's not yet defined, right? So it started with Sweden, and now we see more and more interest in the whole concept and ways to define it and implementing it. And I think what's interesting to see also with the German process, for example, is how there is a focus on process, not just on the outcome and on delivering something directly, but really taking some time to defining it, because there is not one definition. So of course, like civil society, we try to define it and influence it. So having the time to be consulted, to be part of the defining process is already like a super important part of the whole approach of feminist foreign policy and feminist development cooperation. So that's definitely something I want to stress in the beginning. And yeah, I think it's interesting to see how like France is working with a feminist diplomacy, and Germany is having two processes around feminist foreign policy with the Foreign Office and feminist development cooperation in the BMZ. And so maybe because we don't have so much time, right? I think if I speak a little bit more about the process and defining it, and before we start implementing it, I think what's interesting to see is some of the stronger language that we see, but we need to still fill it with context. We heard a lot in the first panel around decolonial approaches, intersectional approaches, feminist approaches. So there is, I think those are concepts that we still need to fill with a lot of meaning so that they don't become empty. And that's also why these consultation processes with civil society are so important. So I think for the implementation, what some questions are is also like, what type of leadership do countries need to implement and define this process? What does feminist leadership mean? So feminist agendas need feminist leadership. But what does that mean for ministries and throughout the process for different actors that are defining and implementing it? I think one important thing that we haven't talked a lot about today, that we need to see like how countries across are trying to integrate it better. The approach is power. So a lot when we talk about intersectionality and feminist leadership and decolonial approaches, that are big concepts. And there is, my impression is there is a bit of a struggle. What does that mean implemented in practice? How can we integrate that? What does it mean? And I think understanding that it is about understanding power, making it visible, analyzing it in different ways, how power can show up, and then integrating into the process concrete measures to shift it. So just to name a few, I mean, we talked a little bit about funding already. That's one of the big issues when it comes around shifting power. Another thing, of course, and that's also something that is super important, is the consultation or convening power, agenda setting power, and decision-making power. How are different actors, how is civil society integrated in all of these three processes? How much power does civil society, does global South civil society have in shaping agendas? Who is convening the process? So I think it's really good to see that we have more consultations, but how can we maybe even shift it from give more convening power to different actors? So how can we shift from consultation to co-creation? That's something very interesting. We explored with in the Generation Equality Forum. Mabel spoke a little bit about it. And there are some action coalitions where these approaches are being explored. And so okay, I think we're running out of time, so I really want to make this point around funding a bit more, because I think that's really core. So there are some really good examples that we see from some of the countries that work with feminist foreign policy, but also other approaches. We see, for example, the Equality Fund that Canada established, and the Netherlands that are working with the fund Leading from the South, and some others. There are still things that need to be improved, but I think what's interesting, especially for Germany, would be like how can there be not just more funding but better funding, and how can civil society be funded directly? And when we took a look at it, a little bit closer look at the funding, I think one thing that became apparent is that there's a lot of intransparency when it comes to like who gets funded, how are organizations being funded, and is Germany able to fund feminist movements directly? Because a lot of the development funds are like or all of it is going to the GIZ. We do have the GIZ. Other countries don't have that and like that. So a lot of the funding goes there. And then through that, there is project funding. So I think a big question is also, what role do agencies like the GIZ, Engagement Global, play in shifting decolonial approaches, shifting funding towards feminist movements and civil society? I think it's interesting to see how different countries are exploring with these different concepts. And I think, we mentioned funding, we mentioned shifting power, we mentioned consultation and co-creation. And I think a lot of things around accountability are important, and measurement. Currently, with Young Feminist Europe, we are involved in one of these global processes around feminist accountability for the GEF, but also beyond. So to really think about what does a feminist approach to accountability look like. It's very interesting because, of course, when we hear 93% of all projects will have a gender equality target, that's good, but like measurement and what we measure and how we measure is important. There is a difference between gender mainstreaming and gender transformative approaches. There is a difference between an intersectional approach and just gender equality. So how do we measure that and also make it practical? Because very often what we see with gender markers, while we need to measure something and we need indicators, what we often see in practice is that it's like kind of an easy tick box. Oh, how many women are involved in this process? Tick. So often there is a confusion with like more women in a project equals a gender justice approach or something. So I think that's also something that the different countries need to look into, how in the future they measure this shift in power over just measuring more women in positions. I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Xenia. I know that Marie Soulier has to leave us in very few minutes. You also mentioned that France implemented a fund for feminist organizations, and at the same time you said, okay, you working on renewing your strategy based on the lessons learned. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit on that, what feminist funding for France means, and maybe what your lessons learned in this process have been.
Many thanks for your question, and I think we are at the moment at the early stage of our evaluation and lessons learned. So it will be a bit difficult for me to go deeper on that point. But of course, perhaps as I didn't mention before, we really wanted to have inclusive and comprehensive approach both to evaluate and renew our strategy. So be sure that we really include all our partners to do this exercise. I think it's important for us to come back to the linkages between feminist diplomacy and the global crisis situation, and how the feminist diplomacy can help to solve or to contribute in solving the crisis all around the world. So perhaps on that sense, France truly believes that the adoption and implementation of a feminist diplomacy is going to be a real game changer in our approach to deal with this multiple crisis. And I think we really want to support this point and also encourage all other countries to adopt a feminist diplomacy, also because we think that in development context as well as in crisis context, having a feminist diplomacy is an issue and is a response to tackle this crisis. So as I said many times, I used to say that we need to wear gender glasses in order to improve our response. And I think in crisis context, it's even more adequate and relevant. Adopting a feminist diplomacy helps us to systematize our approach to issue through a gender lens. And I think it's really important. And also having a feminist diplomacy helped us to adopt a national action plan on women, peace and security that we're implementing in a multi and interministerial approach. We also, France is also part of the Compact on Women, Peace and Security and Humanitarian Action launched during the Generation Equality Forum. We can say that all this commitment go within the umbrella of the feminist diplomacy and help us of having holistic approach on gender equality within all our external diplomacy. So perhaps in terms of if I have to mention one example, we can say that we have found a 2 million euro program in Ukraine for survivors of sexual violence in conflict. And this is also thanks to our internal advocacy within the ministry, but also in the framework of our feminist diplomacy and women, peace and security framework. So it was important for us to mention and to also make the linkages between feminist diplomacy and the way that they can help to address the issue in conflict and crisis context. So perhaps just to finish, and perhaps it could be also my conclusion, we would like to raise a concern that France, but not only France, have about the rise of conservatism. I think within the multilateral spaces, such as UN, G7, G20, and even within the EU, it is more and more difficult, and you are all aware, it is more and more difficult to adopt ambitious documents or deliverables on gender equality or on sexual and reproductive health and rights. And I think we have to strengthen our collective action to tackle the backlash we observe and the rise of conservatism. So I have no solution already ready, but I think we have collectively to think about how we can tackle this backlash and the rise of conservatism. And we think that having a feminist diplomacy is a way to fight every day in these multilateral spaces and ensure we won't collectively lower the ambition of women and girls' rights. So it can be my word of conclusion. And again, we are really glad to see this strong dynamic about feminist diplomacy, not only within a feminist group, as we said before, but in all the civil society. So many thanks again for this invitation and to be part of this discussion. And we are looking forward to continuing the exchanges on that topic. Many thanks.
Thank you, Marie. Thank you for taking the time and sharing these insights. We are also looking forward to deepen that on the next occasion. Thank you for being with us today. Nunzi, Marie also just mentioned the global crisis situation, and I think it's was maybe the same time when the German Ministry of Development announced its feminist development policy fell more or less together with the beginning of the war in Ukraine, and multiple crises coming together in the next months. Against this backdrop, how have been your experiences in advancing a feminist development policy?
You were asking now about kind of the conflicting goals and the barriers we see. One point, of course, is very important. The one that Marie had mentioned is the international pushback, which remains a challenge and is becoming a greater and greater challenge. And we're very, very happy that we managed this year within the G7 context also to agree on some strong points and concrete measures, and also include really progressive language, including on trans and non-binary persons, even the G7 leaders communique, and also explicit references to feminist development cooperation in both the development communique as well as the leaders communique. And of course, language is language and not action, but I think in the context of this international pushback, this language and, maintaining progressive language and not falling back behind agreed language, I think is a very important aspect. And we will continue to push for that in the UN, the EU context, etc. So regarding conflicting goals, of course, it is a huge challenge with the multiple crises, but we do believe that we must not, fall kind of into a trap and only pay attention to one crisis or conflict at a time. But, we live in a time where many different crises are happening at the same time, and they even intersect and, influence each other. So the solution cannot be to focus on the kind of most salient crisis and then disregard others, but instead promoting gender equality and feminist approaches, not as an add-on, but kind of really as the cross-cutting issue, and also the kind of the answer, and also the prerequisite to build resilience and to prevent further crises. So it is now even more important than ever to dismantle the power structures that lead to discrimination and marginalization of people. And this is exactly why Germany is pursuing a feminist foreign and development policy. And it is kind of twisted if you say that, look at the crisis now, look at the war on Ukraine. Is this really the right time to talk about the feminist development policy? Yes, this is exactly the right time, and it's more urgent than ever. So this is really kind of a twisted argumentation, I find. We do see gender equality, as the opportunity also to alleviate the crisis of our time. Not only gender equality, but looking at other inequalities, because of course, we mentioned the intersectional approach before. Inequalities, they don't arise in kind of silos, but they all kind of intersect with each other, and we have to address that. We do on the German, from BMZ's understanding the feminist development policy, we do see that women and girls and all the diversity, we do see them at the center of the feminist development policy for the simple reason that they're the largest marginalized population group. But of course, we do not kind of, we see it in combination with an intersectional approach. Thank you, Xenia. I think there were some points that really kind of they're really, really important around how to shift power and how to, one is how to shift power and understanding power, and the other, of course, how to measure. On the measurement and on your also critical views on the GE marker, I just wanted to kind of elaborate that we do believe that within, we're now starting this road towards this feminist development policy. And there are short-term goals, midterm and long-term, of course. We do believe that the GE marker, with the flaws it has, it is very important to push for stronger GE quota, G1 and 2 within the official development assistance of Germany, but also also to push for it with other partners, because we can experience it now. What it means for a big ministry when the leadership sets out goals to increase the amount of the percentage of measures that are targeted towards gender equality in connection with the GE marker, because people are now starting to actually assess their portfolios also in sectors like energy, infrastructure, urban planning, etc., which are not so much up to now, or not at all even sometimes, seen through a gender lens. So we are seeing this really, really wonderful kind of learning experience within our own ministry. And I do believe that this is one very, very important step towards achieving then the other goals that you also mentioned, that gender mainstreaming and increasing gender transformative approaches, of course, is not the same. And this all has to follow. But yes, I just wanted to add this. And the second point I wanted to add is on your point on kind of the transparency of funding and how can we do better funding. And of course, this is something we have to look at when we take, when you take feminist approaches seriously. I just wanted to make a small correction that not all our funding goes through GIZ. It's 40% of our budget, which is on bilateral development cooperation, and the technical cooperation. And within this 40% goes largely through GIZ and the financials through the Development Bank KfW. But the rest of the portfolio is either multilateral cooperation or I think 10% is the financing through CSO and communal organizations, etc. So I just wanted to add this. Thank you.
Thank you. Then I'd hand over to you, Xenia.
I agree with you around the gender markers. I think it's important to think about how else to measure and what can we integrate. But I also had interesting conversations a few weeks ago with the Dutch government and some people from the ministry, where also these questions were raised, like, is this now a completely new concept, or we are just learning about how to use gender markers, how to and these specific indicators, and now you want us to do something completely different or new? Do we need to relearn everything? And I think it's important to acknowledge that there are people within these ministries, which are very big institutions, that are just, as you said, starting to use all of these tools more practically. So I think it's important to make use of the tools that are already there. And still at the same time have conversations around what else can be added and how can we shift measurements and how can we shift accountability, data, and ways to measure shifting power. And in terms of funding, so that's just a topic that we work a lot on with Young Feminist Europe. So I think I just want to throw a number in, because we need to acknowledge that only 1 to 2% of the whole gender equality funding goes to feminist movements directly in women's rights organizations on the ground. So even if we increase a number of 93% or other countries, even if we increase funding with a specific lens, we need to also understand how much of that funding, it's good to increase it, but how much of that funding really ends up with the movements, with civil society organizations, women's rights organizations, anti-racism movements and organizations, and so on. And also thank you for correcting me around the number. It's 40% or a little bit over 40% to GIZ. And I think what I meant before is also like including funding to bilateral and multilateral funds and processes. So I think what I meant to say was that most of the funding does not end up with civil society, though, of course, there is funding that ends up there. And yeah, let's take a look at how to best do it. I think there are some examples to build on. I mentioned the Equality Fund, I mentioned Leading from the South Fund. I think the UK and some other governments are looking into how to join some of these models instead of creating their own. I think that's really something valid that we need to take a look at. Does every country need to create their own fund? And what are the legal barriers also in Germany to fund movements directly and make funding accessible? So what mechanisms are already there that can be used and built on? And that's my last word to funding.
Thank you very much. I'd like to open the floor now to questions and comments from the participants.
The GIZ is largely focused and structured in their department work around gender dynamics. And isn't it a bit of also the easy way to go to fit some much bigger and complex concept into structures that we have? What I would so love to see is a more open and very transparent discussion around what are our systemic obstacles to really achieve a full answer and response to a feminist approach. So that is my question. Like, where is the critical reflection on our systemic setup, which of course is not so fast and easy to change, but at some point we have to start. Thank you so much.
One part of the answer, I think, does lie in how can we as an institution also be fit to deliver on the feminist development policy. And one part of the answer is, of course, to lead by example and to increase the qualification and competencies within our own ministry in order to, implement and, not only implement, but also plan, a feminist lens on our measures. So this will be, I mentioned that we are in the midst of drafting now the strategy, and this will be one important part of the strategy is, our internal structures and how can we, because this is a barrier, because up to now, gender equality has, of course, played a role in German development cooperation. And I think there are a lot of, engagement activities that we can build on and we can further develop. There's no question about that. But there's been the tendency that gender equality is looked at as kind of an add-on, and something you do, how do you say, a cherry on the cake, and that there are certain sectors that tend to be more kind of gender-minded, like education and like health, but other areas not so much. And this is not because there's no kind of willingness, but there's also no, the qualification and the not education, but what you call it, this, additional training we go through in our ministry does not kind of address that yet. So we want to look at our, our training concepts, etc., and how can we, as quickly as possible, improve these concepts so that we are fit to deliver on the feminist development cooperation. The other part, of course, is the dialogue with the partner countries, which is, of course, can be a challenge. But I think the feminist development policy, of course, would be kind of not true in its own word if we would not look at the local context and look at the views of our partners. And but it's not about going to the partner countries with with our banner on feminist development policy, but I think there is often more room than one might think to discuss certain aspects of feminist development approach. And in some countries with some partners, we might, experience some more challenges, and dialogues have to be more kind of midterm or long term. But I think there are a lot of opportunities and potential with the majority, definitely, of our partner countries. And it's just a question of, consistently, putting this really onto the top of the agenda when we exchange with the partner side.
I think it's important if they are going to define a feminist foreign policy, because you haven't. And in such a case, I think the important point is if we can address the structural issues that remain in the inequalities. And in this case, we need to go further than the health, education, and so on. And we need to enter more in the financial and development in environment and justice and so on. Because if not, we are going to remain in the same activities in the development cooperation, the G7 or donors countries in general have, but not addressing the structural issues. That's why it's so important you go further to consider that and enter to consider the whole feminist foreign policy. I don't know if this is possible, but we need to move on that direction.
Thank you very much. I think this has been also, quite good words for conclusion or looking ahead. And I thank you, thanks to all the participants, for taking the time, for sharing all these insights and perspectives and the vivid discussion. I hope we see each other soon in discussing and bringing this topic further on the national and international level. And thank you for now, and wish you a very nice afternoon or evening.